Welcome, everyone. Thank you again for joining us on these calls. It's always a pleasure to have such a wonderful group. As you can see on the screen in front of you, we have this call and a great topic today and an interesting topic 2 weeks from now. And we're working on filling the pipeline for future calls. Kevin Clark will be facilitating today. If you have a question, just put that in the chat. Or raise your hand and Kevin will try to get to everyone. So with that, I'd like to ask Guy Huntington to introduce our speaker this morning.
Okay, so let me get organized here. Good morning, everybody. I'm Guy Huntington. I'm an old guy, as you can see, and I'm an identity change agent working around the planet. And about 2 years ago on PCI, I met this guy called Pat Scannell, and he sent me this deck. And this deck was astounded me and floored me. Why? Because I'd written thousands and thousands of words, and in one picture, he described everything that I'd writing very simply. And he showed the graph, it's a graph, and it shows a technology-shaped curve almost straight up, logarithmic. And then he shows at a shallower angle our cognitive abilities to keep up, i.e. we can't. Then at a shallower angle than that, he shows our social abilities. Then at a shallower angle than that, he shows our business abilities. And then at the shallowest angle was political. And that diagram resonated right to the core of me. And so we became fast friends. And I got his approval to use his graph, and I've used it in thousands of emails and all my decks and presentations. I refer to it constantly. And in Guy's view of the planet, we have two problems of equal weight, 1A and 1B. 1A is global warming. It's affecting everything on the planet, and it will affect us and the species and our ways of life every day. And 1B is what I call in my head Pat's curve. And Pat's curve is it's limiting us to basically cognitively keep up with change. It's going to affect everything on the planet: our sex lives, our social lives, our political lives, our business lives, everything. And it's scary as well. And as an architect, it scares the shit out of me. Why do I say that? If you can imagine in your head a three-dimensional triangle, and on each point you have people, processes, governance, and technology. And this rapid rate of change means each one of them can be rapidly attacked each hour with new attack vectors. As an old guy who's deployed many large systems around the planet, it scares me because it throws out the door all our old ways of building things and supporting things and changing things. And it's awesomely exciting in terms of transformation. It's also awesomely scary as far as security and systems and support, blah, blah, blah. So I don't want to blab too much. I just basically want to let Pat speak. And he's written all sorts of books. And in a few seconds in the chat, I'll post up his full biography so you guys can read it while he's talking. But basically, Pat is a change agent, and his message is absolutely, utterly important. And I think he should be heard by all the leaders around the planet and all the leading academics and all the business people, because that curve of change is threatening to change everything that we do, and we can't cognitively keep up with it, which is the point of his books and his talks, etc. So Pat, over to you.
Thank you so much, Guy. I really appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen now. Can you verify that you're able to see the disruption of thought in full screen?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Yes.
So guys, today's call is, typically I've done about 30 or 40 of these one-on-one with different leaders in different industries around the world. Today's the first time I've done it in mass. Typically I schedule an hour to discuss this, and we run 2 hours. Today, I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. If somebody has a burning question, feel free to interrupt me. But I'm going to skim the wave tops to try to leave some time for discussion. I'm going to try and get through it in maybe 30 minutes based upon what Chris and I talked about at the beginning. And then I do have a book. And so if there's an ask here, it's first of all, critique orally what I'm presenting in the discussion. I'm looking to be proven wrong. I'm looking to make this better. So I know that's rough in a few spots. And if anybody's interested, I can send you the book that I've drafted on this, and you can pre-read that and dig into the topics that I'm going to skim over now. Does that sound fair? All right. Okay, so I like to, typically my MO is just the opposite of what Guy said. He's talked about thousands thousands of pages that I summarize to one graph. Typically, I'm just the opposite. I'll take a graph and summarize it in thousands of pages. So I try to overcompensate. Here's what I'm going to tell you today. I've developed a new model of human thought. I think it gives us insights into the world that we live in today. I'm going to move this camera a little bit. One of the biggest is, of course, that I think that human thought is undergoing disruption today. This disruption manifests itself in underperformance today in real world ways that matter. And I think it's the most important issue facing humanity. Now, I think we're all familiar with the concept of ideas go from crazy to possible to kind of given and understood. And mine's kind of in the early stage of crazy, and I accept that. If this sounds a little hyperbolic and potentially crazy, I'm fine with that. But keep in mind, this is a problem orientation deck. I'm not going to discuss what we should do about it. There's a whole other, multiple hour long sets of discussions around that. The way I like to say it is, if I came to your office in 1970 and I asked you to engage in carbon credit trading schemes, you'd throw me out because we hadn't clearly demonstrated that there was a problem. The data was ambiguous. It wasn't clear what the problem was. It wasn't even clear where we should be looking. This is attempting to be a problem orientation deck, and it's separate from the solutioning, which everybody wants me to skip to that. But okay, so just some context. I'm a technologist like many of you. My background is rolling out communications networks and the effects on adjacent industries, whether they're Internet of Things, automotive, or the defense industry. I've done that in 2G, 3G, 4G, and I'm now doing that in several 5G. So why the heck am I here to talk to you about cognition? About 7 years ago, the company I worked for got bought, and I had the opportunity to take a few months off, and I stretched that into 2 years, looking at the next waves of change that were coming. And there were a lot of red oceans, obviously, green energy and other things. But I made two big bets. The first was on manufacturing, and the second was on trying to understand what's going on cognitively in our heads that causes us to interact with technology the way we do. And unfortunately, I began reading, and I never found the book that I wanted to read. So I ended up writing two books that are now in draft form at the University of Oxford. I have world leaders in each of the areas. The first book reviews the coevolution of technology and cognition in primates from tens of millions of years ago to the present. And the second one does the same thing for human species. So the reason I'm here to talk to you is I had this kind of nagging interest in how technology caused us to think and how thinking affects technology. And that caused me to do these first two books. And a friend of mine said, don't wait for those first two books to come out. Write the book that you want to, which is what's going on today. So during the pandemic, I've had the pleasure of talking to a couple of folks on this call, but a lot of other folks on some of this draft material. I vetted it and felt good enough about it that I wrote it up into a book, and that's what we're here to talk about. All right, so, I've got a BS in finance, and I told you I'm a technologist, so I'm not about to craft a new model of human cognition whole cloth. What I've done is created a synthesis of existing literature from different fields. I vetted this with more than 10 leading cognitive scientists in different fields. One of them, Jim Giordano, is at Georgetown, is going to be writing this up in a scholarly paper with me. So I don't want to say this is proven, but it's more than just kind of a wild hair. What it really is a three-level, three-dimensional chessboard of thought. I would argue that everybody else is describing it, the neuroscientists are describing it a two-dimensional chessboard. And if you've ever seen the episode of Star Trek, assuming a few of you are geeky enough to remember the original one, there was the Kirk Spock three-dimensional chess, and that's what I'm describing here. The model's not simple, but I think it's more accurate than the existing models that we see through any one cognitive science. So I'm going to condense 60 pages of writing into one slide. The first is that we think with the brain. This is how we all traditionally think. This is how we traditionally conceive of cognition, right? Many of you are probably familiar with the concept of massively modular and the debates that go on within neuroscience that continue to evolve as imaging and other sciences advance our understanding of the brain. It's important to understand that I believe that it's a massively modular brain. There's no like one part of the brain that does memory and another part that does emotions. What they do is they work together in various networks that reconfigure themselves all the time. It's the networks of nodes in what are called modules that are really the undergirding of how we think. It's incredibly complex and it's embodied. We don't just think with our brain. There's a lot of literature that explains that our emotions may be abstracted from how we, it's called introspection, how we feel about the state of our body. So the idea of whether you think that the stomach is a second brain, or you at least appreciate the fact that there's complex interactions between the brain and the rest of the body, is encapsulated in what I call the embodied brain. But I'm going to simplify all that and just call it thinking with the brain. Now, this is where it starts to get a little bit novel for some people, which is I can point to literature, and I do point to literature that says we think through other people. Not only do we think through socially constructed things like words, or socially constructed concepts like myth, money, but we also think culturally with people. Guy and I might have shorthand that's part of the dyadic relationship that him and I have as part of a culture. I, as a white American, might go and interact with others, adopting kind of a white American cultural view of things. The idea that our ideas are not just within our heads, but they're in the shared interactions, much of which is subliminal and unconscious, and certainly not thought about, but we think through people. And then finally, we think through technology. Now, the literature on thinking through technology starts back in the 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. I recommend Merlin Donald on this, but there's several other writers who've developed this. The idea that once we begin to inscribe our ideas on those things outside of us, we've essentially outsourced cognitive, in this case, memories to things around us. Merlin makes the argument that the idea of the higher order thinking that we're so proud of as humans, science, law, the meta, all developed between 6,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago, when we began to outsource cognition, generally in the form of memories, to those things around us. Nowadays, I literally don't know my children's phone number. They're teenagers, because it's on my phone. And I've talked to other scientists my age, and this isn't an uncommon thing. But we're no longer just outsourcing memory to the things around us. As we're all pretty aware, we're outsourcing skills, right? The idea that my daughter doesn't turn her head anymore to look in her when she's driving. She looks in the mirror for the sensor, and she looks in the rear view. The idea that we're losing the ability to navigate, GPS, et cetera. These are kind of age-old now debates, but this is a really important consequence of how we think, is how we interact with technology. I'm not just bemoaning that we're losing skills. I think that there's the opportunity to think differently. And I'll show you some examples of all this. This is the model. Again, about 60 pages of literature reduced into a single thing. These are the 3 planks of the model, but it's also important to remember that all 3 of these are moderated by experience. This is the idea of 10,000 hours or flow, right? You can take something from being a conscious skill to being an unconscious skill. I think it's really important that we, as we go through this, begin thinking about how experience affects things. So I like to point out that Kahneman, who won his Nobel for describing System 1 and System 2 thinking in the brain, points out in his Google talk that it doesn't really exist. There is no System 1 and System 2 in the brain, but yet he won a Nobel for it. His point is that models aren't real. My model isn't real. The question is how is the model helpful for us? So in my case, the model demonstrates not only is thinking very unconscious within our brains, it's unconscious at every single level. You can imagine, a lot of people compare my work at first blush to the social dilemma, right? The thinking that we outsource to the social media companies is hidden behind algorithms, and we don't control those. Mine's a good bit broader than that. I would incorporate any interactions with technology, even self-driving cars or the 4 or 5 hours a day of television that we watch. But I think it's pretty easy to make the case that it's highly unconscious. The fact that it's highly complex, I've kind of described, and I'll give you a couple of examples. This is probably the most important thing, which is values. My definition of thought here on the screen is that thought is the processes we use to make sense of things, achieve valued outcomes. And if our valued outcomes are anachronistic or inaccurate or varying, it's really, really hard to be effective at anything, right? Remember that, that boss that you'd show up for, and every day he'd tell you you have to do something different, but you never got the last job done. This is really worth talking about at length, but I'm going to skip over this and say that there's a chapter if anybody wants to read. But I'm going to give it an extra slide because I've just recently been able to correctly pronounce Thich Nhat Hanh. This story here really resonates with me. That somebody asks the guy riding a horse, "Where are you going?" And the guy goes, "I don't know. Ask the horse." Thich Nhat Hanh says, "I think this is our situation. We're riding too many horses we don't control." I think that my model helps to demonstrate really, really clearly that each of us has different values embedded in each one of these three layers. We have cultural values that we're trying to meet, even if we're not unconscious of them. We have individual values inside of our head, again, even if we're not conscious of them. And then technology has its own values, and through gamification and other types of mechanisms that we ascribe to achieve. And what happens is, as we try to pursue all of these things that are relatively rapidly changing and I would argue inaccurate, our compass is spinning. And I'm going to argue later that this is part of the root cause of many of the social problems we have today. I think it's a pretty easy argument to make that there's different rates of change at each level. The brain evolves, the brain is plastic during the course of your life. But the truth is it doesn't really modify itself that quickly, especially relative to culture, but culture doesn't change that quickly. And then technology changes so quickly. So you have three different levels of change, which adds to the complexity of the picture. This complex web of control, I think is really important. There's a great paper out there I'd recommend in the political science space called The Autonomous Mind, written in 2019, that looks at it from kind of a policy and legal perspective. I go into it in great detail. I think it's really important. And then I spent 160 pages on this point that I call the great irony of technology, but the basic point is thought is not working for us today. Using America as my focus, I developed this idea that most of us are significantly better than we were 50 or 100 years ago. We just don't feel it. And I call this the great irony of technology. Now, if I'm right on this provocative point, what happens as we accelerate technology into the future and it makes us feel even worse off? So I deconstruct this into 15 or 16 different psychographic demographics, and I try to make my case. It's easy to claim that lifespans and human rights and incomes in the United States and education across any metric. Pinker does a good job of this in his TED Talk, talking about how crime is down, health is up. All these things have radically improved. Yes, we have inequalities. I have no doubt about that. But it's pretty easy to go into each of those groups, including affluent, well-educated people, and show that they feel they're worse off than they were before. I think a significant function of this is the technology around us and some of the conditions I'm talking about. So again, I recognize I'm dropping these kind of relatively provocative or potentially controversial points and then running on, but I'm going to do that, and then we can open it up in discussions. So this is kind of my summary here, right? I think that the popular view is that we all kind of navigate through life with this highly optimized brain, making conscious, rational decisions. We have this set of undividable interests inside of our head, and this whole thing works pretty well. My view shows kind of the opposite. It's highly unconscious, really, really complex, really distributed. We don't have much control over it at all. That it's pursuing all these values that I think are anachronistic and rapidly changing and at multiple levels. And combined with the pace of change driven largely by technology, which is embedded in the curves that Guy was talking about, I think it doesn't work very well for us. I think the reason we don't talk about this is it requires not a specialist, a neuroscientist or a technologist or a psychologist or a policy person, nor a generalist. It requires an integrationist. It's such a big, complex thing that it's really hard for us to view through any one of our particular lenses of specialities. It took somebody like me to spend 5 or 6 or 7 years trying to unpack it and tie together these various pieces. Now, this is a bit of an eye chart. I'm going to ask if anybody can see any of the words on the right. If not, I'm going to speak over it. But Guy or Chris, can you just give me a report if these words are legible?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so this is just a visual representation of all those words I threw at you before. So the person with the dots around him in the middle left is thinking with the brain. The next, the three people are thinking with culture, and then the dots with the technology is thinking with technology, right? So this idea that you consciously curate your social media feed, and apologize for reading this, but just in case people don't have this in front of them, you sit there, you watch somebody scroll through their social media feed, and maybe they set their settings, maybe they change their phone settings so they only get certain alerts during certain times. But what's really going on unconsciously, because of maybe the company's algorithms, is that you you have this nested set of unconscious goals that interacts with the technology set of nested goals, that when your phone beeps, you unconsciously reach for it. When you unconsciously reach for it, what you read affects your thinking, and then what you read repeatedly habituates and creates kind of hardened thought patterns in your brain. Now, this is a really, really simple model. The next one is a little bit abstract. I've only got two, but my goal here is to show you the dotted lines are unconscious nodes, the solid lines are conscious nodes, a relative complexity of how these three things are working together, these three planes of thinking. So let me kind of read this as a narrative, right? Mom gets woken up. This is a near future parenting moment where mom gets woken up by her house 30 minutes before schedule because the house informs her that her kid is sick, because they've got biometrics around the bed and her watch kind of informing her that she's tossing and turning and she's got a fever, right? So mom wakes up, she goes, she uses the toilet, she puts on her augmented glasses, she's reading her messages, but the AI is reading her, right? It's reading her biometrics from both the toilet, the how she's reacting to messages, what her eye movements are doing, where they're going. She's using all of this information to curate the social media feeds that she's interacting with, but also adjusting her diet and daily schedule. I don't think this is that too far in the future, and I think some people on this call work with technologies like this. So she goes into her daughter's room using the glasses and the AI. They reach out to external data sources, not consciously, that happens in the background. They connect with data trusts like the data trust at the school in terms of last year's pandemic and the rates of infection. It reaches out and scrapes the social media feeds from her friend groups and tries to create a curated picture of what the potential likely problem is based upon what's affecting other people in her group and what's physically presenting in the symptoms. So it's strep. The AI schedules the doctor's appointment, and this is all happening in seconds, updates the house to make breakfast early, orders a self-driving car, changes the schedule for workout, changes the work schedule, and mom sighs and says, "What would I do without you?" This is not too far in the distant future, and this is an extrapolation of the simple thing I say to somebody, that when the self-driving car saves you 15 minutes of conscious or unconscious thought in driving the car, what will you do with those 15 minutes? How you use that time sets us up for what I'm going to call later the great transformational opportunity. This here is intending to show how the three layers, thinking in the brain, thinking culturally, and thinking through technology, are working together. Note that there's almost no interaction between thinking with the brain and thinking culturally here. It's all highly mediated through the technology. There's no talking to the daughter, perhaps, in this. Maybe that's the only one, but there's no talking to the doctor. There's no talking to the friend groups. Now everything you see is seen through the lens of technology. I'm going to stop there for just a second. Just in terms of the model, is there anybody, is anybody tracking with what the model is? If I could maybe just get a show of hands. I don't have the, Chris, if you can see the chat window. I'm just going to pause. We've gotten through the model, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the disruptive factors, but I went through a lot very quickly, so I'm just going to give it a quick pause.
This is Mike Nelson. I may be missing some key piece of what is brand new here. I mean,
Great.
I understand, putting more emphasis on the unconscious and the technology, but what is different in the way that thinking with technology works from me thinking with my brain?
Yeah, so I'm glad you said that because some of the people I present this to, including cognitive scientists, are familiar with one of these planks, but not the others. Most of the work I talked about with thinking through technology, for example, comes out of anthropology. The work in thinking culturally comes out of sociology and psychology. So just integrating those three planks together, I'm not claiming anything new. I'm just reiterating and tweaking some existing models. And I do this a little bit more at length, giving full credit to the people who've developed these thoughts in the book, Mike. So I appreciate this question. Honestly, I don't think that most people understand that, and most people aren't thinking through the consequences of it. So, Mike, I don't claim to be new. I think I've got slightly different emphasis, but most importantly, I'm trying to popularize this model and the consequences of it. The idea that, for example, the social dilemma would have you think that you are a victim of the social media companies that have unconsciously optimized themselves to attack you. I turn it around and say, all of the media you interact with, including one of the people I talk to a lot is Bilal Hamza, who's the CTO of the cable industry. We spend 4 or 5 hours a day watching television. My argument isn't that the television is bad for us or that video games are bad for us or the social media companies are trying to attack us. I would argue that we're thinking, it's us, it's how we think that's the problem. And by pointing out that it's anachronistic and that it's changing, my goal is to shed light on us as the root cause, not the technologies. I'm going to come back to that later, Mike, but in short, I don't claim much of this is new. I think much of the implications of this aren't appreciated.
I guess the part I'm missing is the integration between the three different platforms. I mean, as you say, people have talked about these three different modes of thinking. Is there something that you're saying about how they work together that I'm missing?
Well, I think they're highly integrated. And at this point, Mike, I'm going to say that you've got a really valid point. And if we get to the discussion and everybody else feels the same way, then I'll send you the book and you can read through it. It's the tight coupling between all of these things that's critically important.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I really appreciate that. All right, so disruption. I have this quote from somebody who said, everything's disruption these days. There's disruption consultants and disruptive seminars. Everybody uses this. It's meaningless. Let me be clear. I don't mean this in the Christensen kind of narrowly targeted sense that it's like a technology disruption. I mean this in the biggest, baddest sense of all. This is a Kuhnian paradigm shift. And I think there's specific consequences for it. I think the fundamentals of thought, and I go into this at length in the book, are rapidly changing. I think the fundamentals of technology that we use to scaffold our thought are rapidly changing. Any one of these would be enough to set us up for a potential paradigm shift, but it's the relationship between all four of these things that make me feel that we're at the doorstep or in the middle of a disruption. So let me talk about this third one. I lean, again, this isn't novel and this isn't my innovative thinking. This is me pulling together different folks. So Baudrillard, some of you may be familiar with, wrote a great book, Simulacra and Simulations. And in there, he talks about the fact that we've lost our relationship to reality. And the best way I can express this is when I talked to a friend of mine who was diabetic. I said, how does it affect your life? And he goes, we were athletes at the time. He goes, it doesn't really affect me much. You're going to go drink a glass of orange juice. I'm going to have an orange. So what we do now in terms of we have lost track of our ability to determine the difference between reality and what's actually happening. So I'm looking outside at the snow. If I walked outside, I'd feel the snow. But if I go on social media and I flip through and I see pictures of the snow outside, I think it's the same thing. The difference is, you know, the difference between an orange and orange juice is there's the sugar of 2 oranges in a glass of orange juice. And it doesn't have the fiber and the peel and the smell and the aesthetics. Well, I would argue we went from the orange, which is reality, to a lightly mediated kind of sense of reality, which is orange juice. Now we're all drinking melted orange juice drink concentrate. Now, if any of you have gone to the store and bought those cans in the store that were like 99 cents that has made from oranges, but it has all kinds of other things in it. The difference between reality and the technologically mediated reality that we are substituting for it is that we're now drinking this thing that has no water in it. It may have some oranges in it, it may have lots of other things in it like chemicals, etc., but it's not reality, and we begin to think it is. It's not just social media, it's the news, it's the mediated interactions we have through even just television, etc. So I would say that we have a changing nature of the relationship with reality, and then this big transformational opportunity. If Donald is right, Merlin Donald, that we had this major change in how we think because we had a cognitive surplus, because we were able to outsource cognition to things around us. We didn't have to remember it. Now we have the ability to reflect on it, refine it, and create kind of higher level orders of thinking, science, law. What happens when we have this massive ability to outsource cognition to rapidly expanding technology around us? I'm not saying this is just a problem. This is an opportunity for us to make a big leap forward. All four of these things together make me think that we're going through a disruption of thought, just as clearly as brick and mortar retail is being, disrupted by Amazon. Now, lots of people write about disruption, but I'm relying here on National Academy of Science and some folks that study outside of the business world. And these are the characteristics: is nonlinear, abrupt, cascading effects, sudden and unexpected effects. Can't be predicted through historical precedents, difficult to forecast the shape it'll take, and it can't be understood with our existing worldviews. That's why this is a Kuhnian shift. The folks that are seeing a scientific shift go on literally don't understand the shift if they're rooted in the old worldview, because that frames their assumption worldviews. I'm pretty much done here. This is my argument that this is the most important issue facing humanity. The boldest of my claims is actually, I think, the easiest to argue. If you look at this chart, which is the World Economic Forum's 2019 Global Risk Landscape, in the middle lower left, or so it's framed the likelihood from left to right is more likely to occur as further right. Impact, the lower it is, the lower the impact, the higher it is, the higher the impact. So low and left, maybe it'll happen, maybe it'll have some modest impact, includes things like there's some social unemployment, underemployment. Well, the ones I like to look at are kind of social instability. There it is, profound social instability, kind of in the middle of the chart in red. If you buy my story, I'm arguing that profound social instability stems from the disruption of thought. Various different groups are experiencing tremendous stresses and cognitive dissonance as a result of technological underemployment. Whites in the South in particular are seeing manufacturing, agriculture, other industries being revamped in a way that their skills don't apply. So they're disoriented. When they're unemployed, their social groups break down. They become more technologically moderated. This creates cognitive dissonance that then gets paired with cultural change, like shifting mores about gay rights or gay marriage or civil rights. So people in the South get this cognitive dissonance of confusion about their jobs, their culture. All of this is changing. So part of my argument is that this is the most important issue facing humanity because it's the root cause of some of these things in the middle of the chart. But that same set of shockwaves, if I'm right, limit our ability to respond proactively and collaboratively to the stuff that is high and right: extreme weather events, failure of climate change, and natural disasters. If we have these growing fissures and cognitive dissonance, what happens is we devolve our thinking down to lower order risk and fight and conflict. If we can achieve kind of comfort and use technology to think better and overcome what I call the great irony of technology, maybe we'll have the headspace and other resources necessary to better tackle some of these other issues. So this is my claim that it's the most important issue facing humanity. I may be wrong, but I've presented this now to the Assistant Secretary of Defense Research for the DoD, the CTO for the CIA, and the Chief Scientist for the DHS, among other folks. And all of them walked away going, there's something real here, and this was not on our radar before. So I make this really provocative, hyperbolic statement. If I'm even directionally right, this hasn't really been an issue that's been tracked and discussed. other than corners and pockets of, the social media and misinformation. And I recognize folks like Pablo and Ed are on here are experts in those fields. I would argue it's not just Russian state actors, it's not just social media, it's the totality of all of this. And I'm going to lump self-driving cars in there just to make my point clear. So I think we're entering this period. In the book, I quote the fact that one of the changes that are going on is we used to go through periods of equilibrium, followed by minor technological disruption, and then equilibrium again. After about 2000, 2005, the ability to return to equilibrium has gone away. And what we have are these accelerating cycles of change to which we never fully stabilize. That creates a highly open system that makes this isn't just about individual cognition. This is about the structures of social order. I presented a talk to NATO in 2018 where I argue that the disruption of thought leads to the potential disruption of civilization. Now, that was provocative at the time, but it was before the pandemic and before Black Lives Matter. I think that these things are feeding off of this cycle that I see. It's not any one technology. It's not just social media. It's not just the web or any of these things. It's all of it. That's the thing that's hard for anybody to sense. It's not an abstract model. Kuhn would tell you that a Newtonian shift would shift out of the Newtonian paradigm, would shift the science focus and experiments. But that's an abstraction. It doesn't actually change the world. My argument is that if we don't solve this, we can't solve those existential issues like climate change. Therefore, what we're talking about literally does change the world. It's not just abstraction. But I'm just going to finish on the note that it's both a problem and an opportunity. I've made these points, but my takeaway that I have you think about is that how we think involved very closely with the technologies we use. And by technologies, I mean, the way we see, color vision, the way we walk, the tools we use across millions of years. Now technology has changed so fast that there's a divergence between our adaptability between our cognition and the technologies we use. I think we're at a critical window of inflection. Read science fiction occasionally, and almost always the people in those books think the way that we think today. I see very few people that are developing new modes of thought using technology to scaffold us into meta levels of cognition that are fundamentally different than today. And by the way, I recognize many of the exceptions to that, but I'm making that as kind of a broad statement. I think this is too complex to understand. I argue that the world that we're in right now is so complex that no one individual or human organization can understand it. And we're entering what I call a post-certainty world. And there's practical implications in the technology initiatives that I launch and interact with, where a post-certainty approach is different than and more adaptive, I think, than the traditional approach that is, I understand how it's going to happen and here's what we're going to do, kind of a top-down approach. Basically, I'm arguing that we need a different approach, a multidisciplinary approach, that we all come together and we begin to look at this issue as a potential source of opportunities, not only to de-escalate issues that are going on today, but to prepare ourselves proactively to maybe make a leap forward based upon this kind of model and cognition as the focus, as opposed to this kind of fragmented, oh, here's a self-driving car, and here's video games, and here's social media, and here's Russian state actors. We have this kind of fragmented views. If we take a step back from that and look at the whole, which is how we think, I think that there's an opportunity for us there, but I think it's so big that it's like this elephant in the room that it's so easy for everybody to ignore because it's outside of the frame of their reference.